Well, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, class. I'm excited to speak with you today a little bit about introductions and conclusions. These are very important to your speeches. So far this semester, as we've been studying public speaking, we've talked about you casting a vision for your presentation. Where are you going, and what's the central message that you want to communicate to your audience? We've also talked about how you're going to craft that message. How are you going to make sure that it's organized and that it flows smoothly from point to point so that your listener can follow along nicely? And we've really been focusing on the body of the speech. Today, though, we're going to shift our focus and we're going to talk about how are you going to package this message? What are you going to do to prepare your listener to hear the wonderful stories and information that you want to convey to them? And then how are you going to make sure that at the very end you reinforce that central message? And the way that you're going to do this is to use an effective introduction and conclusion. So today I have 3 goals for you. Okay, when we finish with this short little mini lecture, I want you to know specifically why introductions and conclusions are so important. In addition, we're going to talk about the 5 key components of an introduction, and we'll also talk about the 2 goals of an effective conclusion. So let's begin by taking a look at a student introduction. In a moment, a short video clip is going to show up on your screen. While we watch this student's introduction, I want you to think about, as an audience member, does this speaker engage you? Are you interested? What do they do to try to captivate your interest and motivate you to listen to the rest of their speech? So let's take a look at this short clip, and then we will talk a little bit about it afterwards.
When someone mentions World War II, do you groan and think, oh, I don't want to hear about World War II, but it happened such a long time ago and it doesn't have anything to do with me? Did you know that swing dancing and swing music, similar to that played by Brian Setzer and Big Bad Voodoo Daddy, was popular in the 1940s? Even some recent movies, such as Swing Kids and Pearl Harbor, are based on 1940s events. Since most war movies portray the roles that men played during the war, today I'm going to share with you the roles that women played during World War II. There are 3 ways in which women helped the war effort during World War II. They worked at home, worked outside of the home, and enlisted in the military. One way in which women helped the war effort was by working at home. To help the soldiers, women rationed food and supplies. They cut back on their use of sugar, canned goods, silk, and gasoline. The canned goods and sugar went to feed the soldiers. The silk was used to make parachutes, and the gasoline was used to fuel tanks and airplanes. When the military had a shortage of aluminum, women donated pots and pans so that the military could make tanks, planes, and artillery. Another way in which women helped at home was they grew victory gardens. Victory gardens are just normal vegetable gardens, carrots, beans, cucumbers, that sort of thing. But the reason that women planted these was because they thought that if they grew their own food, they wouldn't buy so much food from the store, and the store food could be used to feed the soldiers. Now that we've seen how women helped from their homes, let's see how they helped outside of their homes. A second way in which women helped the war effort was by working outside of their homes. Before the war started, not very many women were employed. According to the U.S. Census, less than 14 million women were employed in 1940, compared to 42 million men. When women worked during this time, they were usually teachers, secretaries, or librarians. But during the war, a lot of men were either drafted or enlisted, so a lot of the factory jobs opened up and no one but women were there to work. So women became crane operators, hydraulic press operators, tractor drivers, and miners. According to Conrad Stein, author of World at War, The Home Front, by 1944, 40% of the workforce in aircraft assembly was made up of women. and 12% in shipyards. In 1945, 19 million women worked, compared to about 46 million men. So now the ratio is getting a little closer. And compare that to today, when 65 million women worked in 1999 compared to 75 million men. Now we have seen how women helped the war effort by getting jobs. Let me tell you a third way in which women helped. A third way in which women helped the war effort was by enlisting in the military. In the early 1900s, the Army and Navy Nurse Corps were started. And according to Susan Hartman, author of Homefront and Beyond, during World War II, 31.3% of all active nurses were women. And Doris Weatherford, author of American Women in World War II, stated in her book that by January 1943, all the branches of the United States military included women. Now, not only could they be nurses, they could also be radio operators, secretaries, and storekeepers. But although women were now allowed in the military, they had to meet higher standards and also be older than men to enlist. And they couldn't actually use guns and fight in other countries. For example, my grandmother was in Waves, and I think she was positioned in Texas. But she couldn't be, even though she went to 2 years of college, she couldn't be a commissioned officer. She had to have a degree to be a commissioned officer, so she was a non-commissioned officer. On January 26, 1945, Japan surrendered. This defeat might not have been possible without the help from women at home, at work, and in the military. Not only did women have an effect on the outcome of the war, the women of the 1940s also had an effect on our culture today. Because if the women then had just gone back to their housewife positions after working in the factories, there might not be so many women with college degrees today.
Okay, so now that we've watched this video clip, I want you to think about for yourself, did this speaker really capture your interest and attention? I'm willing to bet that this speaker didn't. While this student had good intentions, the question that she started off with doesn't really make us want to listen. How many of you, when you hear about World War II, you groan? The second that she starts off with that question, many of us think, oh man, she's not excited to talk about this. Why am I going to be excited to talk about this? Maybe there's one or two of you in the audience who you really like World War II. So because of the subject matter, you're motivated. But for most of us, we're already bored and we're ready for her to sit down and stop talking. So I hope that you can see just how important introductions are, and we want to make it our goal as a class to not start off with boring questions, to not start off in a way that confuses our listener, but rather to use these 5 key components so that we really prepare our listeners for the wonderful message that we have to communicate. So let's begin by talking a little bit about the basics of an introduction. What should it do? Okay, big picture, what are you trying to achieve in the first couple of moments that you begin speaking with your audience? One of the main things you need to do is you need to hook your audience. You need to draw them in and really create some interest around what you're going to say. Okay, and I'm going to talk with you specifically today about several strategies that you can use to hook your audience. In addition, you also want to make sure that you're talking to your audience about why this matters to them. How is it relevant to their life? What are they going to gain by listening to your presentation? And then lastly, you want to communicate that central message to your audience. So big picture, these are the things that you want to do. Now, let's talk about how long you want your introduction to be. Your introduction really needs to be short and sweet. You want it to be about 10% of the time that you're going to spend speaking. So for a 5-minute presentation, that's going to be around 30 seconds. And believe me, it's going to go by like that. And if you remember back to our discussion about communication apprehension, this is the point at which you're going to feel the most anxiety. okay? You're going to feel the most nervous at this point. And so your introduction is incredibly important, not only to set up your audience, but also to give you confidence that you can get through this. So I want to encourage you all that you want to plan and prepare your introduction very carefully, and then you want to know it backwards and forwards, because it's going to be the thing that helps you to start your presentation off with a bang, but also help you kind of get over that initial fear. Okay, so it needs to be about 10% of your presentation. Now conclusions, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on today, they're even shorter. They're only about 5% of the entire presentation. They're short and they're sweet, and our audiences are grateful for that. So let's talk a little bit about what you don't want to do in this introduction. What are some common mistakes that speakers make that I know that you all want to avoid? Okay, the first one is that you don't want to apologize for not being prepared. Okay, many of us, when we begin to feel that anxiety, we begin to second guess ourselves and think, oh, I'm not prepared. Don't get up here and say that, okay? For one, it takes away from your credibility. It makes the audience think, well, if this person doesn't know what they're talking about, why should I engage? Why should I listen? In addition, much like I tell you in class, fake it till you make it. You may feel unprepared, but if you don't tell us, we actually might not be able to figure it out. And I think that you should at least try to fake it until you make it, okay? In addition, you don't want to start off with, hello, my name is, and today I'm going to talk about, okay? There's a couple of things that you want to do so that you really draw in your audience before you communicate to them what this speech is specifically going to be about. And I think that when you avoid this introduction, you're becoming more of a polished speaker. Also, you want to avoid starting off with an average, boring question. How many of you? Now, in all honesty, this is usually the first thing we think of when we think about beginning to start our speech. Let's start with a boring question that'll get everybody's attention, okay? But just like we saw in our video clip, starting with average, boring questions doesn't really capture your audience's attention. In fact, it oftentimes turns them off. One last thing you want to make sure that you avoid doing is that you don't want to say, today I'm going to talk about. Okay, don't jump right in there. You've got to prepare your listener to hear the good things that you're going to say today, and you want to do a few things before you actually get there. So now that we've talked about what you don't want to do, let's start talking about the 5 things you definitely do want to do to prepare an excellent and an effective introduction. Okay, and these are the 5 parts. First of all, you want a very effective attention getter. Okay? The second thing that you want to do is you want to motivate your audience or reveal to them why it's relevant to their lives and how they're going to benefit. In addition, you want to establish your credibility. You want to share with the audience why you should be up here speaking and why you're the expert. And then the last 2 things can go together. And this is something we've been working on together in class. Finally, this is where you reveal to your audience your central idea. You want to communicate your thesis statement, and you also want to preview the main points that you will be covering. Now, these 5 components are really important, and if you will do them in this order, I think that you will find you've prepared a very effective introduction. But let's dig a little bit deeper together, okay? Let's talk about how you're actually going to put together this fabulous introduction. So let's begin with attention getters, because remember, that's what you were starting off with in your speech. There are a variety of different strategies that you can use to gain favorable attention and hook your audience. One of my very favorites is storytelling. I think as human beings, we love stories. This was one of the first ways that we really learned to learn and to pass on knowledge to different generations. So people are very favorable towards stories, and you might have a personal story that you want to share that you think is really good. One that I've actually used for a past speech was referencing a current event or a past event that I think a lot of my audience members could relate to. I started off by saying, do you remember where you were on 9/11? I can remember clearly. I was walking into my high school, a junior in high school, and I saw all of my classmates and fellow peers gathered in the library around this old boxy TV. And I remember the emotions and the mood of the room was much different than when I normally walked into that high school. That's the way that I would begin. I would start off with that personal story. You may also come across somebody else's story that you think is really powerful and effective. I had a student one time who was sharing a little bit about breast cancer, and though she herself hadn't gone through it, nor has she had a family member experience breast cancer, she found a really powerful testimony of a survivor, and she shared that story with us, and it was really an effective way to draw us in. Another type of story or illustration that you can use would be a hypothetical story. This would be where you ask your audience to picture themselves in a certain kind of setting. So it could be one, maybe that evokes some negative emotion. Here's one that I've heard that I think is really powerful. Picture this. You're sitting in the car at 8 a.m. In the rear seat, you've got your firstborn. You are dropping him or her off for your first day of kindergarten. They are so excited to be starting school, and you are so excited to take them to meet their class for the very first time. You've got the radio on, and you two are jamming out, and all of a sudden, bam! Somebody hit the back end of your car, killing your firstborn child, all because they were texting and driving. Now, this is a serious story. But it's a very effective way to draw the audience's attention. You've placed them into that situation, and now they're thinking about how they would feel with either their actual child or a child that they hope to have one day. This is a very effective way to begin that presentation. You can also tell a more lighthearted story and put them in a very positive and happy kind of state and ask them to picture a really a positive place and make them feel those emotions. So you can go either direction with those, but stories are a very effective way to begin, whether it's your own personal story, someone else's story, or even a situation where you're asking your audience to think about how they would feel. These are great ways to begin. Another effective strategy that you can use to begin this presentation is to build suspense. Perhaps in your research you've come across some very powerful facts, ones that perhaps would be surprising to your audience. You might want to think about combining these facts together and using them to kind of build some suspense so that your audience doesn't necessarily know what they relate to. Let me give you an example that I've come across with some of my students. It costs the U.S. more than $116 billion per year. It costs the loss of more jobs than a recession. It accounts for nearly 100,000 deaths per year. I'm not talking about cocaine abuse. The problem I'm talking about here is alcoholism. So you see, this student found some really powerful facts and combined them together and didn't reveal until the very end what it was that she was actually talking about. And that's a very effective strategy that you could use also in your presentation. Another one that you could use is maybe you just come across one really startling and powerful fact. Did you know that 1 in 8 girls in the U.S. experiences abuse by someone that they are close to? That's a very powerful fact, and if you wanted to begin a discussion about sexual abuse and emotional abuse and physical abuse in our families, that would be a very powerful statistic that you could begin your presentation with, okay? Another strategy that you could actually use is to use a quote. If you think that somebody else said it better, maybe begin with their words. So take a look at this example with me, okay? As a distinctive childhood wastes away, we watch with fascination and dismay. This insight from Neil Postman, an author of A Disappearance of Childhood, raises a poignant point. Childhood in America is vanishing. If I were giving this speech about childhood in America and how it's disappearing, maybe I want to start with an expert in the field, someone who has a little bit of credibility, and I can begin with their words and their quotes, and that also kind of helps to build my credibility as well. Quotes are a great way to begin a speech, especially if you have one that's really powerful. You just need to make sure that it definitely relates to everything else you're going to say next. If you say a quote and then it doesn't really relate, that can confuse the audience, and that's one thing you want to watch out with when you use quotes. Another couple of strategies that you can use, it would be humor. This is not my gifting. I wish that it was, but it isn't. And some of you are very gifted in humor. So if you've got an excellent joke to tell, this is a great place that you might consider telling that joke. The great thing about humor is that it tends to create a camaraderie between you and the audience. It builds goodwill. As much as you may think you're the only person in the room who feels nervous, audience members actually can feel a little bit nervous for the speaker. And by starting off with a joke or using some humor, it actually kind of relaxes the mood in the room altogether. You do have to watch out with humor though. You want to make sure that your audience gets your joke, and you also want to make sure that it's appropriate for the context. You've got to consider, is this something that's going to make me look good, or is this going to detract from my credibility? So maybe try your joke out on a couple of friends here and there and see if you get the laugh that you want, and also really consider if it's going to be appropriate for everybody in the room, okay? Another strategy that you could use, in addition to humor, might be starting off with a question. But you really want to make sure that you ask a good question. You want to ask a question where you're really getting the audience to think about something, okay? Or engaging them. That's going to be different from the speaker that we saw a little bit earlier, okay? A couple more strategies that you can use as an attention getter would be to reference a historical event or a current event. I gave a presentation to some of my former TCU students about the importance of making the best of opportunities that we are given. One of the stories that I happened to begin with was when in 2012 some of the TCU football players were found guilty of trying to sell drugs, and how that actually caused them to be not only dropped from the team, crushing many of their football hopes and dreams for the future, but kicked out of the school as well. And so they didn't take advantage of some of those opportunities. And because I was speaking to that audience who was familiar with that current story that had just aired about 2 or 3 weeks prior to my presentation, that really resonated with them about why they need to take advantage of the wonderful opportunities that they're given. Okay, so that's a strategy that you could use. In addition, you might want to check out all of the things that have happened in history on the day that you're going to be speaking. This one is tricky, but when it works, it's awesome. The website that I've provided for you will actually give you a list of all of the things that have occurred throughout our nation's history as well as the world on any day that you're going to speak. So if you are speaking on September 19th, you could actually go in there and click on September 19th and find anything that might be interesting to reference at the beginning of your presentation. So I've given you a variety. You can start off with stories. You can ask really good questions that captivate the audience and get them interested about your topic. You could use humor. You might want to combine some really interesting and powerful statistics to really captivate their interest. But whatever you do for the attention getter, you want to make sure that it really draws the audience in and gets them interested. In class, we're going to practice coming up with some of these attention gaining strategies. My encouragement to you is to come up with 2 or 3 as you're preparing your own speech. You want a variety, and then you can choose from those options the ones that you like best, okay? So a couple of things a couple of tips that you want to keep in mind as you're giving your attention getter are these. First of all, you want to know your attention getter so well that you can make direct eye contact with people in your audience while you're delivering it. So if it's a story, I encourage you to memorize it. If it's some facts, I would encourage you to memorize those facts so that you can really look people in the eye while you're delivering those facts to your audience. In addition, you also want to pause strategically. So if you are telling a story, perhaps pause when you finish that story, so that the emotions can really set in and your audience can really feel the weight of that story, and then proceed forward with the other components of an effective introduction. And then lastly, my encouragement to you is to use a combination of these methods. Start with a really interesting question, then give us a fact, and then maybe tell us a story. You want to keep it short and sweet, but the more that you combine these methods together, usually the more powerful of a punch that you can deliver. But attention getters are really the very first thing that you want to do when you're giving your presentation. So let's talk next about the other parts of an effective introduction so that you can really prepare that listener for what you're going to say, okay? The next thing that you want to do is you want to motivate your audience to listen. This is going to be what we call your first listener link. It's the first opportunity for you to connect your audience with your topic and tell them how it's relevant to them. I really love the audience motivation statement that one of my students gave a couple of semesters ago. She had been in a biology class and she had learned a little bit about printing skin cells, and she thought that it was really fascinating. So for her audience motivation link, she actually said, you might be sitting in classes also and learn something new that you had no idea you were so interested in. So be engaged with your classes, okay? Another audience motivation link that you could use would be, as college students, we all want to get a great job after we graduate, and a great interview might be our ticket to that great job. If you're giving a speech about interviewing, now you've told your audience why they should want to listen, how they're going to benefit, and that they're really going to feel more prepared for an interview after listening to you. After you've motivated your audience to listen, the next thing that you want to do is you want to establish your credibility. Why are you the person up here speaking? What knowledge and expertise do you have that you can offer your audience? So let's take a look at this one. This again also came from my student who was talking about printing skin cells. I first became interested in printing cells during a lecture in biology class. Curious to know more, I've researched the latest information and want to share the most interesting findings with you. The student has done a couple of things to let you know why she is the person up here speaking. She's told you her connection to the topic, that she's interested in it and she's passionate about it. She's also told you that she's done her homework. Not only has she taken a class where she learned a little bit about skin cells, but she's gone on her own and researched the topic even more. With a credibility statement, that's really what you want to do. You want to communicate to your audience that you're an expert and that you really are connected to and interested in this topic. Okay? Here's another one, okay, that you guys might want to think about. Believe it or not, you're actually an expert in taking a communication class. So if you are giving a presentation about trying to convince perhaps other people to take a communication course, here's what you could say to establish your credibility. You could say, I'm currently taking a speech class and found many of the topics we covered very helpful. Okay? That's one thing you could use. Or perhaps you could say, I took a speech class last semester and I found that public speaking wasn't necessarily as scary or as difficult as I first thought. These would be excellent ways to really establish that you have expert knowledge and you want to share that knowledge with your audience. Okay? So let's recap for a moment. So far, in your introduction, you have given an excellent attention getter that has gained favorable attention from your audience. You've motivated them to listen, and now you've convinced them why you're the expert and you're the person that's standing up here. You've established your credibility. After we do these three things, it's finally time to reveal your thesis statement and your preview of main points. Okay? So here's an excellent thesis statement and preview of main points that another one of my students has used in the past. There is a need for a change in the current healthcare system. Implementing a system that allows coverage for all children under 18 years old, sets limits on the cost of prescription medicines, and covers specialists can dramatically improve the current system. Just by looking at this thesis statement and hearing it, you know exactly what she's going to talk about in her presentation. In fact, you also know that she's going to have 3 main points and what those main points are going to cover. So these 5 parts all together prepare your audience to hear the effective message that you've presented. I thought it might be useful for you all if I gave you an introduction of my own that I wrote for a presentation. So let me go ahead and give that introduction to you all. Jane wants her couch back. Did somebody steal it? No. Did she sell it and now she's having seller's remorse? No, that's not it either. You see, Jane was an empty nester who moved from suburbia to the heart of New York City to start a new job, a new life, and a new adventure. She was having a great time until her daughter, Sarah, who is a graduate from college, moved into her apartment and onto her couch. In fact, 60% of the 2008 and 2009 college graduates are also moving back home with their folks because they just can't find a job. Sarah did everything right. She went to school, she got good grades, she had a high GPA, she involved herself in community service, and even held several internship positions. But what she found is this wasn't enough to get her a job. You too might be doing everything that you can to ensure your employability when you graduate from college. I can relate to Sarah in some ways. The difference between Sarah and I, though, is that I do have a job. And I don't think my success in landing a job has as much to do with my personal skills as it does with the degree that I hold, a degree in communication. Today, I want to talk with you all about why you should consider pursuing a degree in communication. Specifically, we're going to talk about the 3 types of jobs that you could have if you earn this degree. We will talk about how you can find a job as a corporate trainer, as a human resources department director, and then also working in higher education. So that's my introduction. When I've timed this in the past, it's around 40 seconds long. I tried to gain your attention by telling you a story. It's not my personal story, it's a funny story that I actually came across on the internet. A woman actually did create a website to try to help get her daughter off her couch, and we'll look at that a little bit later. I also tried to motivate you and connect to you. How is my speech about becoming a communication major going to, how is it relevant to you? Well, if I'm talking to a room full of students, they probably are trying to do everything they can to ensure their employability. So they'd like to hear a speech about a job or a major that can actually help them get a job afterwards. I've also tried to establish my credibility by telling you that I do have a degree in communication and I do have a job. And then lastly, I've revealed to you what it is that we're specifically going to talk about in this presentation. So this together is an introduction. Think about it as the package that you're going to use to package your message to your audience. How are you going to set the listener up to hear the good things that you have to say? Now, once you've come up with your introduction, you also want to think about how are you going to bring it to a close at the very end of your presentation. How are you going to wrap up? And there are really two goals to an effective conclusion. Okay? First of all, you want to remind your audience of the main points that you have communicated to them today. You want to restate your thesis, and then if it's appropriate and if you feel like it's not too lengthy, you might want to actually repeat the 2 to 5 main points that you've discussed in your presentation. And then lastly, you really want to finish strong with a bang. You want to come up with one closing line that really communicates to your audience that you're finished so that they know that they should clap, okay? Now, that closing line can feel a little bit tricky, but what I want you to think about is all of the attention-getting strategies that we've already talked about before are great ways to also close your presentation. So you can finish telling a story that you told in the beginning. That's something that I would do in my introduction that I talked about Sarah and Jane, the mother and daughter who can't find a job. You could also end with a quote. Quotes are really excellent ways to bring things to a close, okay? Or perhaps you want to have your audience picture this, imagine this, and you want to communicate to them what life would be like if they did what you've asked them in your presentation, okay? What would life be like if you, as soon as you graduate, are able to find a job? Communication might be your ticket to that job, okay? So introductions are about 10% of your presentation. There are 5 parts to it, and they're really important. Conclusions are even shorter, though. All you really want to do is restate what you have talked about in your presentation and then bring it to a natural close. Thank you very much, and I'll see you in class.